Okay. So today presentation. Thank you for the invitation. I've been listening to some of presentation yesterday. I had a bit sort of a small technical problem at some point. However, the presentation today is about, in a sense, a successful new centralities, actually a new town close to Roma. Roma, the city, the capital of Italy, you see on the right, the geographical context. The blue dot is this new neighborhood. Today is well inside the city fabric. In the 30s, almost a century ago, that was definitely countryside and was quite outside. So a little of background. In the 22, Italy, as is well known, went through a coup, and Mussolini took power, installing the first fascist regime in Europe. But I want to recall also the 29 financial crises, Wall Street, and which hit the rest of the world as well, and in particular the 35 war against Ethiopia that my country fought famously, and which brought the country under the sanctions of the League of the Nations. And the idea of building a new neighborhood for the World Fair which was going to be held in 42. This decision was taken just in the middle between the war and the sanctions, and it's quite apparent that the decision was a political one, meant for international relations, for restoring some sort of a good relations with the rest of the world, and to celebrate the regime, the 20 years of the regime in 42. They were expecting to be lasting for 20 years. The war, which started in 39, eventually put a stop to the construction of the building, of the neighborhood, which was eventually realized after the war, and actually became part of the reconstruction of Italy. So there are a few points that I would like to surf rapidly during my presentation, which infuses the EUR of a quite interesting meaning, the quite interesting group of meanings in terms of both urban planning, political strategies, and some consideration about centralities as well. So one element is that the fascist regime is not a single totalitarian regime, but was actually traversed by interesting intellectual debates. Among the regime, I'm not trying to downplay its authoritarian side, I'm just saying there is a sort of a debate around the role, for instance, of architecture and urban planning as a technique for modernizing the city. And this debate in particular invests the notion of the old city versus the new one. The new one is the industrial city. The regime was in favor of industrialization for political reasons, the need of becoming an independent and growing country, and the other way around, the fear of the working class unions and the fear of the degradation of morale that industrialization would bring, and a sort of a nostalgia of the mythical past in the countryside and the rural peace and so on and so forth. One of the results, however, was that first, the regime did not destroy the historical center of Italy, which was part of the claim of part of the academy, of the architectural academy. So the process of urban regeneration, if you like, was very limited. And the regime decided to build new cities aside, and that was the start of the sort of a new towning movement. Italy built a few new towns, but several hundred new villages in a different part. And in particular, it brought an interpretation of urban planning as a tool of controlling space and local authorities. the central idea of the government, of the regime, was to control municipalities, which were seen as dangerous local powers on one side, and to control space, the region, as a way of controlling city, of containing the city. The point I will want to make in a minute is that this was the idea, the starting idea of the EUR before the war. The actual process of construction, which took place in the post-war times, took another nuance, another meaning, caused a different combination of political and economic element. And possibly today we are facing a new wave, a new turn in the significance of the neighborhood as well. So in a sense, my contribution, which is based upon historical research, which I did for a book to which also Alvaro Buitrago contributed, and some other research we did, is a sort of, I'm going to do an historical presentation trying to focus, however, on a theoretical problem of the relationship between spacing and placing. The political regime create a space which become a building site, which become a place, and the place change the sense of the political decision as well as the spacing. So the eventual question we would like to raise is what centralities do to the city. So just very rapidly, a recall of the men who were behind the decision. That is it's not a sort of a biography, so forgive me for dropping names, but the governor of the city, Bottai, it's important to name it, the one behind the idea of the EUR, was sort of the head of the left side of the regime. Left meaning the modernizing, the more inclined to sustain art, architecture in particular. He was the founder, the first president of the National Institute of Urbanism, by the way, which was a new invention at that time. And he directed a few journals, which were the theoretical journals of the regime. And he was instrumental to push the idea that the city had to be contained. At the same time, a new city had to be built. Second name is Marcello Piacentini, the architect and designer, who was also for some time the responsible for the coordination of the architects team, the designer team of the EUR, and was has been for the long time the intellectual. You see in the picture with Mussolini paying a visit to the central archaeological area of the city. So this guy was instrumental in transferring some of the ideas which were boiling up in the academic circuit of the city, in the intellectual circle of the architects of the city, to transfer them into the actual design of EUR. And the third personality I would like to evoke is Vittorio Cini, who has been the head of the public corporation, which was installed in order to follow the management and the construction of the site. And what is interesting, Vittorio Cini was a very rich and famous industrialist in Venice, and with Volpi was the one in charge of installing the Biennale of Architecture, by the way, of the arts. So it was the side of the regime who was sustaining art, the development of art. Also, that's the point, to react to the 29 crisis and to favor a better image of Italy abroad. So he was instrumental in this idea of the reconnaissance of architectural design as an independent art on one side, but also on the idea that cities, Venice in particular, had to be preserved from the force, the futuristic force of the regime. And in the case of Venice, you see in the picture, it was instrumental to build a garden city on the mainland. Actually, the EUR was influenced by the previous experience. Piacentini was in charge of building the university campus. in Rome. And there are two elements I would like to recall here. One is the purity, the cleanness of the design, which is a simple cross, a very simple organization, very clear. So the spacing of the university campus, there is a major axis, which is celebratory, very academic, and there's a second one which organizes actually the science. The major axis organizes the discipline closer to the power, law and humanities, and the second axis organizes science, mathematics and physics, which are the other leg sustaining. This design idea was transferred into the EUR, as well as the idea of the major public space and the quality public space. The second element, keep in mind the name of this area, university campus, in Italian is the city of university. That's the second idea. I mean, the EUR was conceived as a new town and as an entire new city. It was a satellite new town, but was a satellite new town, and you see here just a two picture of the major axis, which was to connect the existing city on one side here to the new neighborhood down there. The idea was to connect the new satellite city through a huge investment in infrastructure. And infrastructure eventually were the major axis, the road you see, which is a beautiful one, is still working pretty well, as in quite interesting in its functioning, as well as a new railway, the first underground, and eventually, after the war, there is going to be the airport at the end of this axis. So you see, from the idea of a regional scaling, some ideas were brought into the design of the area, which were somehow influencing the idea that the city, the small dot up in the north, was expanding along a linear axis. And this is an idea that in the 30s was common to urbanist theorization in Spain. Alvaro referred to them, or in the Soviet Union as well. And this linear axis should support a series of grains, of which the UR was just one, a series of urban grain that would become the new linear city of Rome. Eventually, the design of the EUR, I say again, that was meant to be the World Fair in 1942, so the name EUR was the acronym of this project. You see two of the final schemes. The one on the left is slightly more bracket modernist and rationalist. The second one, the final one, is the one which was finally adopted, is more the classicist view. So you see the monumentalism, but you see also a couple of elements I would like to sign here, again from the design side. The green area are almost half of the size of the intervention, and a new lake, again, what is a central element of the organizational space. And this new lake, which is absolutely a new initiative for ambition and engineering scale, by the way, is part of the landscaping of the area, and still now one part of the, if you like, the iconicity of the EUR, which is sort, and I insist on the green and blue elements, aside from what is normally evoked, meaning the monumental architecture and a few buildings which are iconic and definitely recall the name of EUR. Eventually, historians have been able to reconstruct the idea of the new plan, which was reorganized according to this decision, sort of a sudden decision taken in 35 of building the new satellite site. So what I want to stress here is the idea that the new centrality, which was outside of the city, which was in the countryside, which was meant to be a balancing weight at the regional scale against the city, eventually deformed the city and deformed the city grid as well, inserting this new element of the linear development toward the south. I'm coming to the conclusion. As I told you, even in the 60s, when Rome hosted the Olympic Games, the EUR was not completely achieved. From this aerial picture, you see probably some of the few iconic elements I was referring to. Up there is the so-called square Colosseum. There are a few important buildings. And even more important, you might perceive the importance of the landscaping, the green areas, and the lake, as well as, keep in mind, the underground, which has been the first the first underground in service in Rome. The service started in the 50s, well after World War II, and give the area quite important locational opportunities. World War II turned the site, they turned the neighborhood into a building site again, and that was instrumental in post-war time to reinvest the building side of the idea that the new country, the new republic, was rebuilding itself from scratch, and so the EUR became the degree zero of the new start of the city after the regime. And very quickly, you see here the new master plan in '62, which now recognize the presence of the EUR here and start to project new developments around it. The yellow areas are new neighborhoods, which eventually will consolidate the southern development area of the city. That's important to note that another idea of centrality was brought to the fore by the '62 plan, and this idea was a very ambitious idea of a linear, an actual directional center, business district in the eastern part, which never succeeded and has been for the last 40 years the nemesis of the plan here in Rome. Of late, this is the last 28 plan. You see the rhetoric of the plan that says that actually green is the green areas are the most important part of the city, and the urbanization is relatively small compared to the regional scale. And that's again something which is ambiguous, can be seen as a sort of an effort in greenwashing the city, as well a prosecution of the notion of the regional scale, which was part of the original idea of the EU war. That is the actual state of the area. So the regional neighborhood, diamond-shaped, with the important lake at the middle, the important natural element, and the vast green areas surrounding it, has become a full-size business center as well as a residential center. So it's a sort of a very mixed, very vibrant new city, and that's the second point, a new city which is today surrounded by new neighborhoods. It's quite recognizable for the period of construction because of the style, and this continuous development has reattached the EUR to the city of Rome. I come to the conclusion. So I would like to answer the question I advanced at the beginning: what centrality does to the city? And in my view, EUR, which I repeat, is a comparatively successful example of an early business district in Europe. It was conceived well before the Défense in Paris, which has been influenced by the EUR, and is an example far more vibrant and more urban than the London Docklands, by if you want a reference. What this teaches us, in my views, that there are different combinations, and the process of reassembling of this element which took place over time. And these elements, I would like to insist, are part of a, if you like, Alvaro will quote Lefebvre in his conception of space and place, are a reassembling of the original spacing idea to create a space well infrastructured, not far from the city, but almost autonomous, a space which was meant to be a deformation of the regional scale of the city, and that was a political objective, a political aim, which was very clear during the fascist regime, but has moved on in post-war time to become quite the opposite. The city itself was in charge of building the region, and possibly today, in a more confused way, there is a sort of a balance between city and urban development. But the assemblage is of the element of spacing, of the element of scaling, as well as the materials. And that is quite important. I try to emphasize the influence of the infrastructure, of the green spaces, as well as of the iconicity. And this element, the material, was instrumental to call in new actors. If the World Fair was mostly a political, ambitious objective, in post-war time, business and private corporations have become the principal actors of the neighborhood, and they came to start the headquarters, possibly because the materials that were combined in the spacing of the area. And of late, and the new plan was instrumental. The EUR is part of the new polycentrism of the city, which is a provisional and partially unsatisfactory definition of an emerging regime which is reorganizing the city. So my conclusion, to make just a short and bold statement, is that centralities move the city. So the city is not anymore the same. That's what I would like to emphasize. We have to consider it centralities and peripheral centralities in something which is not anymore the same city as it was before. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Marco. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has been emerging in my mind over the last 2 days is, moving away from a simple kind of geographical notion of what the center is, in the physical sense of when we look at urban or metropolitan spaces and what we think of as the geographic center. We clearly have a variety of kind of different centers, and multiple centers kind of can coexist and are overlaid with one another. So there may well be a kind of a political and institutional center, which might be the geographic center. But we see, certainly in parts of Australia here, we see central state governments decentralizing their activities out into the regions, out of the peripheries. So we kind of see a displacement process going on there as well. So for me, there's a multifacetedness and a multidimensionality to try to understand this notion of centralities and peripheralities, and the symbiotic relationship between both. So with all my babbling on there, I'm going to open it to the floor for questions for anybody, or comments, if anyone wants to make some observations. And Alvaro, I see a virtual hand up there, so I'm going to defer to you.
Yes, thanks. Hi, Marco. Good to see you again. Thanks for the presentation. I have always found quite fascinating how the EU has this kind of broad and this versatile quality, and how it has been able to change through time from a kind of colonial celebration, as you said, at a point when Italy was beginning this kind of colonial project, to actually very recent times. It's not that usual these days, but I remember about 10 years ago that it usually these images of the Palazzo della Civiltà, they usually featured in car advertisements, you know, in publicity for cars and other things, like as a symbol of modernity. And I was wondering what is actually, because I've been there a couple of times but never really managed to make a real idea of what is the image of this place in the local imaginary in Rome for the inhabitants of Rome. And I was wondering if you could maybe comment something about that. What is the actual, in this, you know, in this kind of very complex constellation of symbols and meanings, what is actually the vision that the inhabitants of Rome have about this place? Yeah, it's kind of a tricky question, perhaps, but maybe you can say something about that.
Yeah, it's not a tricky question, it's an important one, and I'm going to give a very short answer and possibly a tricky answer, Alvaro. Meaning that, you know, architecture, the regime lasted almost 20 years. So it was more than a generation. So it was very influential upon the Italian culture, and architecture was considered to be the left branch of the regime, which means basically that most of the architects after World War II were intellectual of the Communist Party, so they changed entirely, you know, ideological vision, and were instrumental to establish an understanding of the regime architecture, an appreciation of the regime architecture. So in this sense, there is a continuity with the idea that Italian genius is better than any political compromises. The other way around, I try to emphasize other elements, material element of the EUR, which are not often evoked. I mean, the quality of the landscape, the quality of the infrastructure, which is very important in the city of Rome, as some junction of the city of Rome are comparable to the Bangalore example that we just saw. So this quality of elements are highly appreciated, have been highly appreciated by people in the city in the last 50 years, in the post-war time. And finally, third element is this story of evolution, the reassembling of the elements. The Nazi army retreating from the south of Italy occupied the EUR as a military camp during the war, in a way washing away the sins of our regime. And the building site in the post-war time have become the site where, for instance, the Christian Democrat headquarters was built, was invested by the new authority of the Republic, precisely because it was not anymore a place. It was redefined in terms of a site, of a space, no? And as if it was possible to give a completely new meaning. And in a way, that was successful. So the colonial museum has become the ethnic museum. And the fascist headquarters has become the Christian Democrat headquarters. And that was sort of the reinvestion of the buildings by a new meaning, which is a process which took place for the last 50 years. So sorry for the very quick answer to a very interesting question.
Okay, I see Nick's got his virtual hand up again. So Nick, over to you.
Again, people are getting pretty tired of this virtual hand of mine, I should think by now. Apologies. Hey, thank you, Marco. Very interesting and very multifaceted, as Paul said. And one comment and one question. So the comment is, you know, sometimes we have this perhaps binary of plans reflecting the actual development pattern that comes to be, or what we hope that plans shape the development pattern. And of course, what we have here is an example of the recursive effects between those two. So both, not either or. So I think it's kind of a great example of that, and that's, you know, the circularity of what we're dealing with when we're talking about urbanization. But the question is a simple one, and I guess I just wanted to know a bit more about why the second example you briefly touched upon, that linear second city, why that hasn't materialized compared to the EUR. I have some inklings from what you said, but be good to hear from you.
Okay, I haven't the time to deal in depth with this second example, which is extraordinarily important for post-war the Roman development. It was a typical case of a modernist and reformist, sort of a Brasilia kind of attitude toward urban development. We, the good planners of socialist faith, we were fascist 20 years ago, but that's forgiven. We are now socialist, and we are modernizing the city, and modernization means infrastructure and business district. And the new idea, the design idea of the linear city, and the choice of the eastern neighborhood, which are the poor ones. So we are bringing development to the poorest area of the city. Why it didn't work? First, the size. I mean, it was definitely immense and was a major national project, which was possibly too large for the city and for the ambition of the city and the condition of the state. Second, it was a reformist attitude in a way. No, it picked up the eastern part of the city, and there was extremely strong opposition from the right-wing corporation and parties that didn't want to favor, in a way, the development on that side. And possibly the third element, it was not really thought about the technicalities. I mean, it's a hard project to combine and highway and underground and office spaces and green area along an access road for 12 kilometers. That would require an organizational capacity, which was underestimated, a lot underestimated at that time. So I think also the granularity of the project was not compatible with the city of that time.